Welcome to the Creating Hope podcast, powered by Suicide Prevention Scotland and Public Health Scotland. This podcast is for people working to prevent suicide in local communities and aims to provide information and inspiration to support us in our work. I'm Susie Heywood and I'll be guiding you through today's episode, which focuses on bereavement by suicide. We hope to broaden people's understanding of suicide bereavement and reflect on the ways that we can provide compassionate and person-centred support to people bereaved and affected by suicide. Bereavement, and especially bereavement by suicide, is an emotive topic. And so I want to let you know that we may discuss things that you find difficult or distressing. We've included helpful links in the show notes, and at the end of the episode, I'll give you some further information if you're worried for yourself or for someone else. So, let's meet our panel for this episode. Jonathan Ellenor is a member of the Suicide Prevention Scotland Lived and Living Experience panel. He lost his father to suicide at age 12 and is a strong advocate for better research into suicide among older men, as well as improved support for the families left behind. Jonathan works in marketing, and outside of that is a keen cyclist and photographer. Trish Hafford Letchfield is Professor of Social Work at the University of Strathclyde. She does research with marginalised communities on their ageing experience and care, and the work of her team has supported improved understanding of suicide and later life. Lara is a Service Manager for the Scottish Government-funded Suicide Bereavement Support Service. She manages this work on behalf of Change Mental Health, who deliver the service in Highland. She has lived experience of losing a close family member to suicide after her brother, Graham, ended his own life in 2019. And finally, Nicola is Director of Client Services at Cruse Scotland, where part of her role includes the organisation and delivery of group support for workplaces that have been impacted by suicide. Nicola is passionate about the importance of having open conversations about death, dying and bereavement. Welcome everybody. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I wanted to start by asking you all briefly to reflect on why improving understanding about suicide bereavement is important to you. And I'm going to come to you first, Nicola.
Yeah, I think whenever I put on my service delivery head from Cruse Scotland, bereaved by suicide is the third top reason why people contact us for service delivery, for support. And that comes after cancer and heart conditions. And when you think of the number of deaths there are in Scotland from cancer and heart conditions compared to suicide deaths, that gives you some sense of the impact of what it has on our bereaved population. So that's certainly why I'm here today, because it's a huge part of our service delivery because of the impact that it has on so many people. Yeah,
that's quite striking. What about you, Jonathan?
So I'm a part of Suicide Prevention Scotland's Lived and Living Experience panel. I lost my father to suicide when I was 12, and being part of this panel has allowed me to give something back. But I'm also very passionate about understanding why particularly older men basically take their own lives in such large numbers, and that's one of the things that I advocate for on the panel, and that's kind of why I'm here today.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you. I'm going to go to Lara now.
Well, I'm here because I am the project manager for the Suicide Bereavement Support Service, working for Change Mental Health. But I'm also here with my lived experience hat on. I lost my brother to suicide in 2019. And I'm from a West Coast Scottish family. We didn't have the vocabulary to be able to talk about it. And I think it's really important to try to create safe spaces where you can talk about suicide, and we give more people the vocabulary to be able to do so.
That's great. I mean, I think you're right. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast today, was to kind of have this conversation about something that some people find very difficult to talk about, but actually it's really important that we do. Finally, Trish, what about you? Why is improving understanding about this topic important for you?
Yeah, I mean, having had a long career as social worker managing older people services, I'm now that I'm working in higher education, I've been researching ageing and trying to focus on people in marginalised communities, such as those affected by suicide. And what really struck me was how the experiences of bereavement by suicide for those in later life is just so under researched. And I came across a study in 2019. There were no studies whatsoever in this area. And given, it's such a traumatic experience to be bereaved by suicide. And when you think, we all think about our later life, it really must have an impact on, what you expect from your later life when you retire, etc. And so, I thought it's so important for thinking about quality of life when you're getting older, and being bereaved by suicide can really dramatically impact on that.
So, what is it that makes suicide loss different? And I guess I'm thinking, Nicola, about how striking those statistics that you gave about the numbers of people that are contacting your service. What is it that makes it different? Jonathan, do you have any thoughts?
I think fundamentally the thing that makes it different in my experience was two things. One is how people react in the immediate aftermath, and second is how people react over the longer term. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people find it very, very difficult to talk about suicide, and they also find it very, very difficult to talk to the families and loved ones of people who've been bereaved by suicide as well. And I think, there's a great deal when people die in natural circumstances about celebrating their life and remembering their life. And I think the thing with suicide is people find it much harder to talk in those terms. So if someone takes their life through suicide, they're very rarely celebrated in the way that people are who die of kind of natural causes. And it's that kind of hushed tones when you talk to people about it. It's almost like people find it very, very difficult to relate, I think, to anyone who's been bereaved by that. And secondly, I think it's the silence that comes with it. That's what I've always talked about, is the silence around suicide, that it's almost like after the person's gone, it's like nobody wants to bring it up. No one wants to talk about them. And I think that's one of the hardest things over the longer term, is that people just don't talk about your loved one. And that can be within friendship groups, but also in families as well. When my dad died, as a family, we've hardly talked about my dad since the day he died. And I think that's one of the real sort of challenges, I think, that any sort of network of friends, family will come across, and also that sort of wider group as well.
Yeah, and I think it really resonates with me, because I think we're not a nation, we're not people that are good at talking about death, dying and bereavement anyway. And I was going to say that when it's a death by suicide, almost the volume gets turned up on that, but actually it's the volume gets turned down on that, isn't it? Because we go so silent on that, because death and dying is uncomfortable anyway. And then when you have the stigma or the layers that suicide brings, it's like, well, how do we talk about that? And do we say the word? Do we say the name? And people get themselves tied up in lots of knots about talking to. And we find within our service that even talking about somebody who has died in lots of other different ways is hugely difficult for people, and then this brings in such different complexities. So yeah, really resonated, Jonathan.
Trish?
I mean, I think that, for older people, they're more likely to have a lot more losses in life, but the people we spoke to said it really is an uncomparable experience. It's one of the most traumatic type of losses that they've ever experienced. And but I think when we think about older people, they often say how they feel invisible about their grief, and it's not their grief isn't noticed because they're expected to deal with grief. But they then take on a lot of substitute roles in the family, roles that they might have done all their life, and then they return to those roles. It can trigger a lot of past experiences where there's been, difficult family relationships, or problems. And they also feel very wary about the natural order of things. They were supposed to go first. And they then can feel very guilty about that, and then that impacts on how they might express their grief.
Yeah, I think that I totally resonate with what you're saying there, Trish. There's a real kind of hopelessness as someone who's been bereaved by suicide. That obviously, everyone's going to die at some point, and everyone is bereaved at some point. But around suicide, there's a real bafflement. It's like the feeling that if all those things that you thought were true, all those things that you thought were real, are pulled out from under you so easily, then nothing's ever going to be the same again. And, so there's a real kind of feeling of being left bereft and hopeless for the future, which is different, I think.
I think it's interesting, Lara, what you were talking there at the beginning about how difficult you found talking about it within your family.
Yeah.
It was the same for me, and that was 30 years ago. In society, we say, we've learned to talk about suicide, but in reality, I think certainly within a lot of families, we haven't really learned to talk about suicide. And I think one of the other interesting things that makes suicide different from other forms of bereavement is how individuals respond to it very differently. So, we've got, I come from a large family, and everyone has responded to it in a different way. And that's, as I say, in the short term and the long term. And I think that's one of the sort of challenges as well. So when you try to talk about it in groups, people respond very differently and have got very different experiences of that. So I think it's really interesting that Lara mentioned that we haven't really moved forward in lots of ways in how we deal with this. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm struck, Jonathan, as well by you saying we don't celebrate their life in the same way, and it's almost that then the manner and the nature of their death defines something of who they were in life, and we don't do that with other deaths. We don't, if you die from cancer, that doesn't define what your life was, but yet in this, and I think that is one of the differences, that somehow this defines the living part of their life as much as the death part of someone's life.
Jonathan, you spoke there a little bit about how different people have different reactions, and I guess within our work we talk a lot about how different people can be affected by a single suicide. And I wonder, Lara, are you able to talk a little bit more about that, about the different ways that people can be affected by a single suicide?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a statistic that says 135 people can be affected by any one suicide, which is a huge number. I live and I work mainly in the Highlands, and I work with a lot of remote and rural communities. So when a suicide occurs up here, it can really affect everyone within the whole of the local area. So that number, that ripple effect, feels even bigger up here. But in terms of people that we support through our service, it is mainly close family members that we support. However, we opened that out because we found that we were being approached by work colleagues and neighbours. We were being approached by first responders who were on the scene after a suicide. And also, witnesses, people who had found somebody after a suicide had occurred. And there didn't seem to be any support for them. So we made sure that our service was able to offer that support more widely, because all of those responses, all of those grief responses are valid, and people need to be supported through them.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes when we speak to people who have been bereaved by a suicide, they themselves feel that they weren't offered the support that they felt they needed. So if we're actually looking at all the different people that have been affected, we really need to make sure that our responses have that flexibility and able to respond. Cruse Scotland have been offering support to workplaces who have been affected by a suicide bereavement in some way. Can you tell us a bit more about why workplaces are an important setting for that kind of support?
Yeah, and just tapping into a little what Lara said, I think the workplaces, they have unique relationships with the person, and quite often in the work that we've done, it's been somebody in the workplace that was the last person to see them before the death happened, or they've not appeared in for work, and they're the ones phoning to say, so-and-so's not turned up for work, or, is everything okay? So they can be often very key in those, the last moments and the first moments. And in work that we've done, some of the stuff that I've been really conscious of is the stuff that happens, that's a locker needs emptied or a desk needs cleared, and there's family photographs on that, or what happens whenever a new person starts work and they're hot desking and they sit in their seat and everybody else in the workplace has avoided that seat or respected that seat, and here somebody unwittingly has come in and sat in that seat, and sometimes the family will want to come and visit the workplace because they've never seen the workplace, but they want to almost put context around where that person lives, back to that kind of, the death is so difficult and we want to know something about how they lived, and often we don't know what each other's workplaces look like. So I think there can be a real family sense within the workplace that ripple effect, that, and I think you're right, Lara, that 135 is only a drop in the ocean in many communities, and you think how many people in the workplace might be impacted by that. So we've seen some very sensitive, difficult, real deep grief, and there's friendships in workplaces as well. There's socialising in workplaces, so it's a bit of a hybrid space of lots of connection, and we know that grief comes when connection's broken. So that's a lot of grief in there. And a lot of questions, could I have, should I have, was there something in their behaviour? They do all of those questions as well that often families would be asking, families and friends would be asking the same things. So that's what we see in some of our workplace support, the interconnectivity of that.
And do you support workplaces where there's maybe been a suicide of a client or a service user? Does that feel different? Does that look different?
Yeah, that's we've done some within first responders, as Lara touched on. Somewhere it's been the death of a colleague, and somewhere it's been the death of a service user. And what's been really marked in those is that often that's with teams of people who this is their daily work. They're used to working with risk. They're used to working around difficult mental health challenges. They're used to working around complexity of addictions, and so this is almost their bread and butter job in terms of what the complexity that those service users might bring into their lives as in their day jobs, and yet the impact of a death and often there's been relationships that's been built up with those service users, often over years. There's been longevity. So they're navigating not just the death of the service user, and I don't use that word just lightly. It's different than that because there's been relationship, and it's happened on their watch, and that's huge. And even though they have systems in place for support, for supervision, for looking after each other in the context of the workplace, there's something about coming together as a team and saying, this has impacted us as a team and a collective of people that cared for that individual.
I think it's great that we've got this service available to workplaces, and I know that the service is not just for workplaces. You also work with community groups, church groups, places like that, schools. So it's amazing that we've got that support, and I think you've really summed up very well why it's needed. I wanted to kind of go back to a point I think that we've started to make. I think, Jonathan, you made it really well about the kind of silence that surrounds people's experiences of suicide. And I guess the word that we very often use is stigma. And I wonder if we can just spend a few moments thinking about the role that stigma can play in people's experiences of suicide bereavement. I wonder, Lara, if you've got any reflections from the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I think stigma has a really profound effect after a suicide occurs. It affects our emotional responses, our social interactions, and also people's ability to seek support because of all the feelings that there are around shame, around guilt, even embarrassment are really intensified. And I think also people can feel that sort of responsibility for what's happened. They feel that they're being judged. How could they not have stopped it? And all those kind of feelings that you feel the public feel or what you sort of internalize yourself as someone who's been bereaved. So we see that a lot in people that are coming into the service. It's really, really hard to reach out and ask for help when you have all of those feelings going on within you. So yeah, it has a profound effect on the people that are left behind.
Trish, I wonder if that kind of echoes your experiences of older adults and their experiences of suicide bereavement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stigma sort of, it gets compounded by ageism in our society. So I think for older people, they think they feel invisible. They don't feel worthy of seeking support, and like they've got less importance in the effects of the suicide. And this kind of manifests like they may not seek help for their health conditions because they interpret that as grief. Often older people are not considered for counselling or therapeutic support, and they don't feel entitled to it because of their own sort of self-ageism. And I think that that can really compound sort of post-traumatic stress later on, become very hypersensitive to comments from professionals, other people in their networks, and heard a lot of people talking about feeling tired of life, begin to lose themselves. And of course, we know that, that suicide bereavement is itself a risk for suicide. And I think in later life, when people are thinking or reflecting about their own mortality, I think this can really compound and be difficult.
When we speak about suicide bereavement, we often hear talk of disenfranchised grief. And I wonder, Nicola, can you explain a little bit more about what this means and who this can affect?
I think the workplaces are probably a good example of where grief might be disenfranchised, and that's a big word for and
for me,
for any of us in the mornings. And it's really where we feel we don't have the right or the permission or the relationship that we had with that person, that we shouldn't be grieving in some way, and we can do that to ourselves. We can kind of say that I was just the colleague, I was just the cleaner in the workplace. What right do I have when there's a family and there's friends, and we can take ourselves out of that situation, or society can put that upon us, that actually, what right do you have to grieve when you had no connection to that person really? But grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't follow a rule book like that. And if we have a relationship with somebody, whatever that relationship is, a connection to somebody, that when that connection is broken, that's where grief comes up. So we have to give that, time and space and compassion in and around that. So, that's what it is when we feel I don't have a right to grieve, or why am I grieving this, and just taking some time to explore that. So that's where disenfranchised grief sits for me.
And I'm wondering about particular groups. The one that's in my mind is children and young people. And, my experience of bereavement when I was young, we didn't get to go to the funeral. We were kind of really protected for very worthy reasons, I'm sure, from that. But actually, in some ways, you were excluded from some of the kind of the grieving process. And I wonder, I don't know, Jonathan, if you've got any reflections about children and young people and how that kind of disenfranchised grief can show up there.
Totally, and like yourself, I didn't go to my dad's funeral. I was sent off to play snooker with one of my friends at his house, and to this day, we still, every now and again, when we chat, we talk about this really odd day where it was almost like, kids can kind of distract themselves and then they'll be fine. And I think certainly back then it was very much a case of, as a child, you were given very minimal information, which then, I guess, impacts you much later in life when you start asking questions. It took me 40 years to get to a point where I could get some therapy and kind of deal with some of those questions that I'd never kind of asked myself and never answered. So I think for children, it's really important, I think, that as adults we feel confident that we can share what's happened with children. And I think if you don't share with children immediately, you lose that opportunity. And we all know it gets harder and harder and harder to talk about things the longer it goes on. And certainly that was my experience in terms of my relationship with my mother. It was like not having that conversation on day one means it's almost impossible to have. And you end up, it's kind of the elephant in the room that gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And that's when I think, those long-term impacts kind of come into play. So it's really interesting that you said you weren't, you didn't go to the funeral as well. It's one of those things that you always think, I'm sure I'm the only person that happened to. So
yeah, and I think often it's with good intentions, isn't it? It's like often it's with an intention to protect the young person. And people are worried about they'll not understand or they'll not. And actually, children are sponges for soaking up emotions and soaking up and reading a room and knowing that something's not right. And I would say it's probably one of the most difficult areas of our work whenever we have a young person who's brought to us for support and they don't know what's happened. And the family don't want us to, they don't want to tell the young person what's happened. And that is difficult on lots of levels, particularly if the young person has sussed that something is different here. And that's very difficult to navigate because it's come from those best intentions. It's come from wanting to protect, but yet it leaves such space for children to often make up horrendous stories in their own thought. And we know how trauma works. We know that trauma isn't just what you've seen and felt and experienced. It's what you've imagined and the weight that you've put on that.
I suppose the other thing as well to mention that just kind of popped into my head there is, when I lost my father to suicide, the only media really was the local press. Now with social media and sharing, it's almost impossible to keep what's happened from anyone. And I think there's nothing worse as a child for finding out what's happened through a third party as opposed to a loved one actually sort of sitting down and telling you. Because then as a child you think, well, am I not supposed to talk about that? Am I not meant to ask? Am I not meant to acknowledge that I actually know what's happened? And that again leads to internalizing of grief, internalizing of stress, and that can have really profound impacts on children as they go through life and how they learn then to sort of relate to their own emotions and their own experiences.
Yeah, and it can also break trust in a family that I've not been told this information and I've heard it from a third party. And what does that mean for the trusting relationship that I thought I had? I had a very similar conversation with a friend of mine just this week where very different circumstances of death, but she was explaining to her young child, kind of early school age, what had happened. And what she said to me, and I thought this was really striking, was that her young person, although they're not on social media yet, but they're only one Google away from the information about how the death happened. She wanted her young person to hear it from them, the truth from them. And, how you phrase that and how the language you use around that, hugely important, but telling the truth in an appropriate way to young people, I would say vital, actually.
Going back to the kind of idea of stigma and disenfranchised grief, and Trish, I think you kind of reflected a little bit earlier on about the impact that can have then on the support that people expect or seek for their suicide loss. And Lara, I know that when we've spoken before, you've had some reflections on this. Can you tell us a bit more about why some people may not feel worthy of accessing support for the loss?
Yeah, I think sort of building on what Trish was saying earlier, it's a lot of older people that are coming into our service just don't feel worthy of receiving that support. We've actually had people who've been referred into the service who, when we call them to offer support, they say, "Oh, well, just give your support session to someone younger because they deserve it. They deserve that support." So it's quite extraordinary, that kind of sort of not feeling worthy that can be a response that we get.
No, I think that's a great point. And actually, at risk of going down a rabbit hole, I actually had a really interesting conversation with someone yesterday, and they gave a really good example of they use it in training with people. And it's, you're on a desert island with a baby and an older adult, and you can save one of them. And everyone in the room was like, well, I'd save the baby, of course. But then they were saying in other cultures, it would be the opposite. It would be, we would save the older adult. And I wonder, Trish, if you've got any further reflections on how, some of our societal ideas about ageing and things might have an impact on the support that people feel able to access.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting when we did in-depth research with older people, and we used peer researchers, like people who had lived experience, older people, we trained them, they did the interviews. And what was really interesting is that both the researchers with the lived experience and the people who interviewed said that it was the first time that anyone had ever asked them about their experiences of the suicide, even if it had happened quite a long time ago. And I think it's something about in later life about the timing of the suicide that people tend to reflect on and within their life course, and it affects how they cope with the loss and what it's associated with. And I sort of remember one woman talking about she'd lost her daughter, and she sort of said, I'm glad it happened when I was older because I had more time with my daughter. And I've got less time to be able to cope with it. I don't have to live a long time with it. I thought that was so moving, that she had less time to endure, with the loss. And then for those people who had retired, they talked about feeling so alone, and all their plans had been scuppered, and they kind of felt a real silence, the silence that you were talking about earlier, Jonathan, and the lost opportunities for, they were not going to have grandchildren, which they anticipated. Who's going to notice if they start developing signs of dementia? Who's going to look after them, or who's going to support them in their later life? I think it's just more taboo in later life because they feel that they shouldn't raise their own issues about who's going to look after me because other people need care more than them. But I think there is this thing about having less time to get your life back together, and I think people talk about it as being a living experience, and they're never gonna adapt to the loss. They're just going to be able to live, learn how to live with it, and time, of having to learn to live with it or having not enough time, to not having to deal with it was just a really interesting area.
Thanks, Trish. And at the risk of putting you on the spot, Jonathan, as the only man in the room, so to speak, I guess I'm quite interested to see if you've got any reflections on men coming forward for support around suicide bereavement and what might be some of the kind of the barriers to that or the stigma that might mean that they feel less able to do that.
I'll try and keep this answer short because it's one of those ones I could probably talk about for the next 6 hours. I think there's a whole area about how men relate to their emotions and deal with their own emotions, and I think it's still one of the kind of the hardest aspects of masculinity, I guess. We hear a lot of talk at the moment about toxic masculinity, but I think this is another side of masculinity that's not talked about as openly, about how men relate to their emotions and how they relate to each other when they're going through an emotional crisis. And I think it's one of those things that will always be an issue for men. It's men find it difficult to talk about their feelings, mainly because as we're brought up, we tend to be brought up not to talk about our feelings. It's that kind of man up, all of that kind of stuff, which we know is really negative language. And I think, it's great that there's support groups now, like people at Andy's Man's Club, that allow men really to come together, not with any particular agenda, but just allow men to gather and talk about things, talk about experience that they're having in their life, whatever that may be. And a lot of the time that will open a door to then say, actually, I could walk through and now I can reflect a little bit more on myself, and perhaps there's some therapeutic options I can follow, or perhaps I can just learn to talk to, my friendship group in a little bit more of an open way. So rather than just sitting and talking about the football down the pub, talk about actually some experiences we've had or something we've reflected on. And I think that's one of the things that over time will get better. But I think it's always going to be a challenge, and it's the way that men are sort of brought up, I think.
Yeah, isn't it fascinating? Here we're talking about older people feeling like they don't deserve the support, that it should go to somebody younger. We have men saying that it might be difficult to access support that suits them, or difficult to engage with those emotions, and we're we're protecting. We might have children there that we're putting towards support, and we might not be telling them why we're putting them towards support, or what the context of the death is. And then you've got these people in the middle that are probably worried about their aging older parents. They're probably worried about the men in their life that they need support, and they're worried about the children and the young people in their life. And it's like, oh my goodness, nobody's actually having the conversation of what do you need, and how do we get you to it, and how do we do this together? Do you know, in the relationships, just what you're saying, down the pub, wherever those healthy connections are, where we're meeting each other, and we don't go there in the conversation because it carries that stigma. So everybody's silenced. That's hard, isn't it? Gosh, how do we get past that?
What have you observed about what people need or want then following a bereavement by suicide, at the risk of maybe generalising? Because I guess what we do know is that everyone's different, aren't they? And everyone's going to need something different. But what have you observed in your practice?
I think it is around that difference. Jonathan, what you needed as a 12-year-old boy is different than you need as a grown man. I think it's the right support at the right time in the right place. But that needs longevity, and that needs eyes on it at lots of times. And that's where the challenge comes for those of us that are service providers for perhaps a bit in the journey. So it's getting that bit, I think, tied up, that 12-year-old Jonathan gets to where he needs to be, and adult Jonathan gets to where he needs to be, and we get to plug bits of that in.
Yeah, I agree with that, Nicola. I think it's about having options. It really is, and about. I'm just sort of thinking about people that come into our service, because we can offer over the phone support, or video support, or face to face. And I think it's really interesting, the high numbers of people that want support in their own home, in the safety of their own home. And again, that might well be around the stigma that's involved. But yeah, just having those different options to people at the different times that they're going to need support. So that could be in the immediate aftermath after a suicide, or it could be 2, 3, 4 months after the suicide, or it could be years and years after a suicide has occurred. And we have been supporting people who haven't been able to say the person's name, the person that they lost to suicide maybe 5-10 years ago to suicide. They haven't been able to say that person's name. And so they come to our service at a time where they are finally able to face up to those feelings of grief and devastation that they felt, that they didn't have the ability to discuss at the time. And I think, just having those different options of support available at those different times when people need to access it is so vital.
We've heard a lot from people who have really, like, after time and, having, lived through that experience, they've really taken up opportunities for leadership role with peer support networks. And I think that really seems to serve a good purpose for older people who might otherwise be isolated. They've got that life experience, they've got their own experience of the bereavement, and they really are keen to give advice, support others, and get that support from others. Because generally in a suicide, that what I've found is older people do talk to each other. They might not talk to professionals, they might not talk to younger people, especially their families, because they're not supposed, they're supposed to be there to support and care, but they will talk to each other. And I think there's something there about formalising, giving lots of opportunities for older people to talk to each other in a very authentic way about what they're going through. They don't have to say much. I think we need to think about that more when we develop support services, because I think they're not likely to go online and like younger people might and seek help, or they don't see like they shouldn't be airing their dirty washing in public, so to speak, but they will speak to each other, and they seem to get a lot of comfort from that.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting though? Because I'm imagining, imagine that as a lunch club or a coffee morning or whatever that looks like. Those people that are providing those spaces probably don't see themselves as a bereavement support organisation or a suicide prevention organisation. They probably don't get funding to run their lunch club or their supper club or whatever for those things. And that's the chat, because it's like, how vital is that? How vital is that you're getting people together that have that shared experience, that it's in an environment where they can talk together. But who funds that? Do you know what pillar of funding does that come? Yeah. And that's where the challenge, because these things are vital as we build communities that are strong and robust and can go, just create space to go to those difficult conversations.
And I think it's one of the real strengths of our approach in Scotland to suicide prevention and suicide bereavement is the absolute recognition of peer support as being a vital part of the support that's offered to people. So we've got a range of services that are available to people bereaved by suicide across Scotland, from services like yourself or Lara that may be providing one-to-one support right through to kind of very grassroots-based community peer support. And I think that point about people being able to find their way to the right service at the right time, and having that kind of flexibility and choice is really coming through quite clearly for me.
And it might not look like a service. It might look like their Tuesday coffee place to go. But having those people, and I know that some of the suicide prevention work they've been doing is about how do we get some of this training into hairdressers and barbers and taxi drivers. It's actually, that's why. It's because this is where these conversations are often being had.
I'm wondering, and I guess this question probably comes from my own experience of knowing someone who's been bereaved by suicide and really feeling at a loss and quite scared about what to say, really frightened of saying the wrong thing. So I guess as we're coming towards the end, I wonder if anyone's got any tips or suggestions that you would give to someone who may be in that sort of position, who may be supporting someone bereaved by suicide, whether it's in a professional or personal capacity. What are the kind of key messages that we would want to give those people about how they approach it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of older people are hidden away. They're at home, they go to limited spaces. I think there's been a lot of work about creating more spaces, intergenerational spaces for older people. And I mean, I've done a lot of training with professionals who are in touch with older people every day, going into their homes, or domiciliary carers. And often older people will make throwaway comments, about themselves, like, they should shoot us, or I've had enough, I don't want to be here anymore. And what happens is they tend to get jollied along, or told, silenced again, like, oh, don't say that, and I think that we need to learn how to authentically listen, be in the moment, and respond more appropriately by asking people, how are you feeling, or what's going on at the moment for you, or that must be acknowledging just that sounds very very sad, and would you like to talk about that a bit more, rather than silencing them. And I think that's so important. We need to really learn to do that with older people.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying there, Trish. And also, I think it's important that suicide bereavement is still a bereavement, and you treat it in the same way as someone that is supporting someone who's lost someone to suicide. Say something, acknowledge the bereavement, use the word suicide if that is what the person who needs supported needs you to say, but be led by that person, be led by what their needs and their wants are. And again, that is about really actively listening to what those needs are.
I think that there's opportunities around anniversaries and birthdays, and we're recording this just after Mother's Day, and we have Father's Day, we have Christmases. There's points in the year where we can initiate some of those conversations for people to say, I'm imagining today must be a difficult day for you. Do you want to talk about your mum? Do you know we can inject that in, and it takes confidence to do that sometimes, because we don't know what we'll be met with. And if we got better at being comfortable with meeting other people's emotions, that would be quite helpful. But there's times where we can intentionally go into a conversation, and I think that would be one of my top tips to people who are not directly bereaved themselves, that they can open a conversation, and finding simple ways to do that and to acknowledge it, and it might just be a little WhatsApp message or a little text message to friends and family of, I see you today, and I'm imagining today might be a difficult day. And actually that day might be a really good day. I was like, actually, I've had a lovely day. The sun was shining in Scotland for once. That was miraculous in itself. And, you can, and just meeting people where they're at. But it's not always easy. So, eyes on birthdays, eyes on high days and holidays, and those can give space.
Yeah. And I think thinking about the stigma and the silence, that if we can be that person that names the person that they've lost, that remembers them, that gives them an opportunity to talk about them if they want, feels like a really good thing that we can do even years after the event, because that person was still important to them, and still they want to remember them, and they want to talk about their life, and just being able to kind of give them those opportunities feels like something really, really important that we can do.
Yeah, and it's taken the moments, isn't it? I'm thinking actually it was an extended family member of mine died by suicide a couple of years ago, and every time I see a dry stone wall, I think of him. And I've, every so often I'll just take a wee photograph of that, and I'll send it to the family member that I'm directly connected with, and just say, I'm just thinking about him today. And it gives a moment of connection, and it allows the name to be said, and it allows a little bit of time back, and sometimes they'll step into that and sometimes they won't. And we probably all have stories of what it's felt like to receive something that's had somebody's name, or just that you're being thought about on that day, and that's it's being seen, isn't it?
Or even if you get it wrong sometimes, if you do mess it up, the interaction, I think it's nice to go back and say, oh, I've been thinking, what you said last time, and to respond, take the opportunity. Don't feel embarrassed by it, because I think that, as Jonathan was saying about that going on, that embarrassment, that avoidance, the longer it goes on, the more difficult it gets. So I think, we've all had moments that get a bit awkward, and I think just being brave enough to go back and follow up with the person and acknowledge that they may need time and to talk about the person they lost.
Yeah, I always remember from some training that I did around suicide bereavement, and one of the people who was involved in developing that training had said something that has always stuck with me, and it was, the worst thing has already happened to me. There's nothing that you can say that's going to make this any worse for me. The worst thing you can do is say nothing. And I think for me that was really powerful, because I stopped being afraid of getting it wrong after that. And probably I still do get it wrong, but as you say, Trish, having that chance, reflecting on that and checking back in feels really important. Jonathan, I wonder about you. What message do you want to give about what are the top tips from you?
Yeah, I think just building on the words we've used there, bravery, I think is the big one. It's about just feeling confident enough to just talk to someone. You'd be amazed how just opening a door, one line, how are you feeling today? I was thinking about your dad. I was thinking about your mum. Like you say, it must be a difficult day today. But it doesn't have to be on a special day. Just basically being brave enough to talk to someone about someone that they've lost, and remembering that it's not the suicide, as we said, that defines the person. It's the loss. That's what people remember. I don't think about my dad as someone who died by suicide. I think of him as my dad. And I'll happily have a conversation with anyone about my dad and what I remember and why he was a great man and a great sort of role model in my life, and how sad I was that, he went so early. But having the bravery and the confidence to just talk to people, you'll be amazed how opening that can be, and how rich those conversations can then develop into. And I think that would be my kind of message.
And what a great one to kind of wrap up on. And I love the word brave and bravery. I think we should use it more, and we should think of it as a concept in everything that we do. Before we finish though, I think it's important to acknowledge the difficulty of supporting people bereaved by suicide, or the impact, that can have on us who are supporting people bereaved by suicide. So I wonder if anyone has any reflections on, as we do this work, how we can better support ourselves and our colleagues. And Nicola, I'm going to come to you.
I think those three words of time, space and compassion resonate for me in that. But it's about giving ourselves that. And we're often, when we're supporting other people, we're often not very good at cultivating our own internal time, space and compassion towards ourselves, towards our immediate family, friends. So for me, it's, and I'm the world's worst. I'm realising as I listen to this, when it'll come out on the airwaves, that I'll need to pay attention to my own wise words, because we're rubbish at it sometimes. So it's, how do I give myself time, space and compassion so that I've got the resilience to keep going and to keep being brave, because it actually takes energy to be brave and to be courageous in these conversations. So how do I top myself up so that and that's looking after myself.
I'd like to thank Lara, Jonathan, Nicola and Trish for joining us today on the Creating Hope podcast. And I'd like to thank you for listening. It's important that we talk about suicide and suicide bereavement openly in this way. And I hope you've gotten as much out of the conversation as I have. Conversations like this are breaking the stigma around suicide loss, creating hope, and can help to ensure that people who are affected by suicide are met with a compassionate and helpful response. So please do talk about what you've just heard and share this podcast with others who may be interested or may benefit from some of the insights that have been shared. We've included links to information about support that's available in the episode show notes, so please do check those out. Finally, if you're concerned for yourself or someone you know, please know that help is available. You can call Samaritans on 116 123 or use the online chat at samaritans.org. Alternatively, you can contact Breathing Space on 0800 83 8587. You'll find the NHS 24 Mental Health Hub, where you can speak to a specially trained mental health advisor by dialling 111. And if you're ever in immediate danger or have the means to cause yourself harm, you should dial 999 and request an ambulance. Thank you again for listening today. We are so glad that you did.